Protestants have built up this whole historical mythology about how the Jewish canon was supposedly fixed early on by the time of Christ, and how none of the Jews had ever received or accepted any of the Deuterocanonical books as on the same level of inspiration or authority as the rest of Scripture, with the implication that Jesus, the apostles, and the early church believed the same thing. But the team over at Apocrypha Apocalypse have gone into great detail to deconstruct and debunk this Protestant house of cards, these myths and misinterpretations of Scripture, Josephus, the early church fathers, and other sources. The team has also gone into great detail to show the positive case for how the ancient Jews did at one point accept some or all of the Deuterocanon and only later rejected them after the rise of Christianity. I'd encourage you to check out the in-depth analysis on their channel's videos. But for this channel, in this video, I want to give a more simplified, accessible, and summarized version of all that material at Apocrypha Apocalypse. In my attempt to simplify and summarize so much complex information, it is quite possible that I may wander into slight inaccuracies, misrepresentations, or overstatements, but I've tried my best not to do that and welcome any feedback on that point. The first and oldest piece of evidence that the Jews accepted some or all of the Deuterocanon at one point is that the Jews translated into Greek the Deuterocanonical books that were originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic. All of the Deuteros were likely originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic, except for Wisdom and 2nd Maccabees, during the time period of the 3rd to 1st centuries BC. Now, according to my research, we do have Jewish Egyptian fragments of the Septuagint showing that at least diaspora Greek-speaking Jews used the Septuagint during the time that the Deuterocanon was likely written. Additionally, archaeological evidence of ancient synagogues and Philo of Alexandria's writings show Jewish reception of the Septuagint. While none of this evidence points to Jewish reception of any specific Deutero book, this would be an argument from silence, and may merely be due to the general scarcity of evidence to begin with, the genre of many Deuteros, and their later date of composition. But it begs the question, if most ancient pre-rabbinic Jews supposedly didn't think the Deuteros were inspired scripture and didn't use them supposedly, then why did they translate them into Greek? The first Christians were Jews, and so early Christian reception of the Septuagint would also indicate early Jewish reception, at least among some Jews. And the earliest, most complete Septuagint codices are Christian Bibles. The first two codices listed, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, are dated to the 4th century, before Jerome's Vulgate, presumably. Vaticanus appears to be missing pages at the end of its Old Testament. If this is the case, then it is possible that the Maccabees were included at the end. Sinaiticus is also missing many accepted books, like Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, so it is possible that it too may have included Baruch and the Maccabean books that just didn't survive. And Ephraemi Rescriptus is extremely fragmentary, missing every book of the Old Testament except for wisdom literature like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Job, and the Deuteros, Wisdom, and Sirach. So it too potentially could have included more Deuterocanonical books. In fairness, Some of these codices do also include books that are not in the Protestant or Catholic canon. But these codices are highly indicative of the larger Catholic canon among both early Christians and ancient pre-rabbinic Jews who used the Septuagint. In addition to the Septuagint, there was also a revision of it called the Kyge Recension that dates to the 1st century before Christ, that contained at least Baruch and Deuterodaniel. David Zaraz's video on the Jewish reception of Baruch goes into more detail on this, if you're interested. Then, of course, there is evidence from the famous Dead Sea Scrolls of the Qumran community, who had more copies of Tobit than several other Old Testament books that both sides agree are canonical. There were 6 fragments of Tobit, 2 in Hebrew, 4 in Aramaic, 2 to 3 fragments of Sirach written in Hebrew, and there were also fragments found of Sirach at Masada and Cairo Geniza. And Qumran scholar Emmanuel Tov says that books like Sirach were written in a special layout reserved for biblical compositions, which would indicate that Sirach was not just among the library at Qumran, but also considered sacred scripture there. At Qumran, we also find a fragment of Baruch 6, also known as the Letter of Jeremiah. And so the evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls certainly points to the existence of different Jewish sects having different canons, rather than one settled Jewish canon before Christ. The contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls also point to a larger Jewish canon that included at least some of the Deuteros among at least some of the Jewish sects. Lastly, the Dead Sea Scrolls also disprove Jerome's Hebrew verity theory regarding the manuscript lineage and Masoretic text. If Jesus and the New Testament authors use the Deuterocanon in dependent, significant, and instructive ways, that also indicates reception of the Deuterocanon among those Jews who became Christian. Gary has done several videos showing this and has recently done deep dive live streams on this topic, so check them out. I won't go into the same depth as Gary Machuda and William Albrecht have, but I'll give a fairly comprehensive overview of the best references to the Deuteros in the New Testament. Let's start with 10 references that are even cross-referenced in the Protestant 1611 King James Bible. No one can accuse Catholics of reading the Deuteros into these New Testament references when the editors of the King James Bible, Protestant editors, saw the same dependencies or allusions. Without going through all of them one by one, I'd like to highlight a few of them. Wisdom 2 either prophesies the taunts of the Jewish leaders against Jesus on the cross, or the Jewish leaders are explicitly and intentionally appealing to Wisdom 2. In John 10, we see Jesus observing the Feast of Dedication, also known as Hanukkah, the origin of which is found in 1st Maccabees. In Hebrews 1, we see the author drawing upon Christological concepts found in Wisdom 7. And Hebrews 11 clearly ends its biblical hall of fame with the Maccabean martyrs in 2nd Maccabees chapter 7. Here are even more additional New Testament references to the Deuterocanonical books. Again, some of the most significant examples here draw upon the Deuteros for fundamental Christology about the Word or wisdom of God being a person, dwelling with us, but also sharply judging us, as we see in John 1, Sirach 24, Wisdom 9, as well as Hebrews 4 and Wisdom 7 and 18. Other references illuminate the person of Jesus Christ as the satisfaction of all desires, as we see in John 6, Sirach 24, and Wisdom 16. And the yoke of Jesus' teachings as easy and fruitful, as we see in Matthew 11 and Sirach 6 and 51. Lastly, we also see very strong allusions to Judith 13 in Luke's account of the inspired words of Mary and Elizabeth at the visitation. It should be noted that if you take all these New Testament references into account, all 7 Deuterocanonical books are referenced at least once in the New Testament. As one can see in my video on the early church quoting the Deuteros as inspired scripture, it should be noted that some of the earliest church fathers also saw some of these connections between the New Testament writings on the Incarnation and on Christology and the Deuterocanonical books, especially Wisdom 2, Wisdom 7, and Baruch 3. Let's move on to Josephus, who is often wrongly brought forward as a witness to the Protestant canon. Gary has many videos showing from many different angles that Josephus was not giving a canon, and that there's no good evidence of it matching the Protestant canon, even if he was supposedly giving a canon. Check out those videos on the Apocrypha Apocalypse channel. But in terms of evidence from Josephus that supports the thesis that the Jews did at one point accept at least some of the Deuterocanonical books, we can see that Josephus repeatedly says in his Antiquities and other works that his Antiquities is based on the Jewish sacred books. And so when we look at his history, it seems to indicate that Josephus considered the Maccabees to be sacred books, since Book 12, chapters 6 through 10, follows 1st Maccabees very closely for the history of the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean dynasty. There is no reason to think that Josephus considers Maccabees any less sacred merely because it is a history. After the destruction of the temple, and after the writings of the New Testament and Josephus, we see the rise of Rabbi Akiva and his quest to replace the Septuagint with a different Greek translation that fits his own post-temple revisionist revamp of Judaism and its scriptures. Check out Gary's videos on Rabbi Akiva. The 2nd century Jewish translators Aquila and Theodotion apparently executed this grand vision of Akiva to replace the Septuagint. And Protestant scholars admit that these translators, their versions, included Baruch and Deuterodaniel. Let's transition from the Jewish testimony about the Jewish canon to Christian testimony about the Jewish canon. Melito of Sardis is one of those figures Protestants try to appeal to support their 66-book canon. But Melito's list is missing the Book of Esther. Moreover, Melito is a bishop corresponding with another Christian bishop, and yet they don't know the Christian canon? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And even if they didn't know their own Christian canon, wouldn't they ask other Christians rather than Jews about what the canon is? So, almost certainly, Melito is giving a Jewish canon that can be used to extract evidence and arguments in favor of Christianity. But for the purpose of this video, I want to draw your attention to the fact that Melito's Jewish canon list includes a reference to wisdom. While this could be a reference to the Book of Wisdom, Gary Michuta makes a strong case that Melito is actually referring to Sirach. I'll refer you to his videos for more details. After the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, perhaps the largest Jewish community was Alexandria, Egypt. Famous Christian writers and scholars from Alexandria interacted with the Jews there and also provide testimony as to which books the Jews in their region accepted. While the books of Maccabees do not seem to be among the canonical books of the Jews, for some reason Origen decides to mention the Maccabean books and their Hebrew name. Why would Origen do that if at least some Jews of his time did not preserve and use those books? He also makes mention of an epistle of Jeremiah, which could indicate Baruch. And then Athanasius tells us explicitly that he has heard that Baruch is handed down and used among the Jews. Lastly, drawing upon the slide material of David Zaraz, I think it is worth pointing out that Roger Beckwith concedes there is evidence of Jewish reception of Sirach and Baruch. And Beckwith is a very popular and prominent scholarly and secondary source among Protestants who defend the 66-book canon. I'd encourage you to watch David Zaraz's video on the Jewish reception of Baruch for even more details. He goes over how the Jewish reception of Baruch likely extended into the 4th and 5th centuries and was likely used in Jewish synagogue worship. David also addresses some alleged errors or contradictions in Baruch. There is even more Jewish and Christian testimony of some level of Jewish reception of at least some Deuterocanonical books, lasting at least into the 4th and 5th centuries, but I won't get into all of that here. Now that we've taken a look at the evidence for Jewish reception of at least some of the Deuterocanonical books, let's switch gears and look at the evidence for the 2nd century Jews changing their canon, removing or rejecting Deuterocanonical books, and thus creating different canons among the Jews and the Christians. Not only did Rabbi Akiva wish to replace the Septuagint with a new Greek version, more accommodating to his new version of Judaism, but he also wished to standardize the Hebrew text in the same manner. Check out Gary Michuta's videos on the Apocrypha Apocalypse channel for more details on how Rabbi Akiva went about making a new rabbinic Bible and its implications and consequences for the canon. Along with standardizing the Hebrew text, early 2nd century Jews under Rabbi Akiva rejected the New Testament writings and Deuterocanonical books simultaneously. In Tosefta Yadayim 2, we read, "The Gospels and heretical books do not defile the hands. The books of Ben Sirach," meaning Sirach, "and all other books written from then on do not defile the hands." This passage indicates that there were Jews and Christians who thought of the Deuterocanonical books as holy, inspired scripture. But because Sirach had already previously enjoyed widespread usage among the Jews, we learn from Sanhedrin 100b that Sirach had to be withdrawn from usage from their canon. Check out Gary's in-depth video on this topic, where he explains how the Hebrew term genaz typically referred to older, worn-out writings of Scripture that were removed from usage. But in this case, the withdrawal of Sirach is motivated by canonical revision and closure rather than the deterioration of old scrolls. Let's move on from Jewish testimony to changes in the Jewish canon to Christian testimony of differences between the Jewish and Christian canons, apparently created by Jewish changes to their canon. Contrary to Jerome's erstwhile Hebrew verity theory, and contrary to Protestant claims that Christians depend on the Jews for their Old Testament canon, here Origen sarcastically and clearly rejects the notion that Christians should depend upon the Jews for their own Christian scriptures. While he doesn't specifically refer to canonical issues here, the clear logical implication is that Origen did not believe Christians should rely on the Jews for their canon either, which will become very explicit, as we will see. Origen argues that the Jews removed the story of Susanna from the book of Daniel, even though that passage is received and accepted by the churches. It should be noted, Justin Martyr also makes this same accusation in his dialogue with Trypho, chapter 71. Here we get some very interesting and valuable testimony from Origen that Jews and Christians do indeed have different canons, and that the Church uses Deuterocanonical books like Tobit and Judith, but the Jews do not. Why don't the Jews use Tobit? We get an interesting answer later from another popular figure in the canon debate, Jerome himself, who explicitly says the Jews removed Tobit from their canon, from their catalog of divine scripture. Rufinus is a great witness to just how radical and revolutionary Jerome's shorter canon was at the time, how completely contrary it was to the long-standing tradition of the Church. He criticizes Jerome for removing Deuterodaniel, the story of Susanna, against the tradition of the Church. Similar to Origen, Rufinus goes on to mock the notion that the Jews know better than the apostles which books are true and sacred. Clearly, Rufinus believes that Jews and Christians have different biblical canons. Read the full passage below for yourself. To Rufinus, it is inconceivable that the Jews know the canon better than the apostles and the Church. It is inconceivable to him that after nearly 400 years, the Church would find out that the apostles had not delivered to them the truth of the Old Testament, and would have to send an embassy to the Jews, begging and beseeching them for the true scriptures, and that the Church would have to confess that she had somehow been in error for 400 years. He goes on later to compare the situation of the Church, begging the Jews for the true canon, to the bride of Christ forsaking her husband for Barabbas, because the apostles had supposedly given her fake jewels instead of genuine ones. I'd like to end this video with a roughly chronological summary table of all the evidence we've gone over in this video. As you can see, there is very substantial evidence that the Jews before Rabbi Akiva accepted some or all of the Deuterocanonical books as sacred and inspired scripture, and only later changed their canon to remove those books, causing some confusion among Christian writers and leaders about which books the Jews did and did not accept. The confusion and diversity of Old Testament canon lists of the early church writers was apparently driven by the confusion and diversity among post-temple Jews themselves. And when we focus in on the specifically Christian sources, like the Great Codices and the New Testament itself, we see very strong evidence in favor of both Jewish and Christian reception of the Deuterocanon. So, what do you think of this video? Let me know down in the comments below. Even if you disagree, if you received some value from it, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Thanks, and God bless.